Well, I want to welcome everybody. Thank you so much for taking some time to enjoy and share in this special interview that we have the privilege today, actually, with Jerry Jenkins, author over 200 books. That's incredible. Of just the thought of the amount of time that's gone in it, but how that God has used you. Also, in working with your son, I have a question later to ask you about, but your son Dallas working through with the series The Chosen, and very, very popular. And so, again, we are abundantly blessed by having this time to get to sit down and get to chat with you. Let me ask you a question. You were born in Kalamazoo, Michigan, right?
Right.
Now, with that, some people when they grow up, I want to be a fireman, a policeman, an airplane pilot, a nurse, a doctor. Did you ever think you would be an author of over, of hundreds of books when you first were growing up?
No, I didn't. I wanted to be a big league baseball player, and a lot of people say that they wanted to be a big league baseball player until they saw a big league curve. My problem was the big league fastball. That's what I couldn't catch up with. But my it's funny you mentioned the number of books I've written. I think my son Dallas teases me. He says he thinks he's pretty sure I've written more books than I've ever read. And that could be true. But my mother actually taught me to read before kindergarten, which made me kind of an obnoxious elementary school student.
Uh-huh.
And the joke in our family was that by first grade, I was reading at a fourth grade level, and by college, I was still reading at a fourth grade level. So,
Well, it's interesting. You mentioned about your mom. My mom had a tremendous impact on my life growing up. I grew up in a single parent home, but
mm,
God got a hold of her life. She became a Christian. So very instrumental, and there have been other people along the way, but she was instrumental in your life spiritually. But then I thought it was interesting in some reading I was doing that there was a painting or something that also had an impact in your life. But could you tell us a little bit about that?
yeah, I was privileged to be raised in a family with both parents and both consistent church-going Christians. I hear from so many prodigals and people who are deconstructing their faith and I usually find that they had parents who were one way on the weekend and a different way during the week. And my parents were consistent. They were the real deal. My father and my two older brothers were at a church event one night, and I was just 6 years old, too young to go. And my mother used to let me ride the back of the couch like a cowboy. She said it says more about the couch than about her parenting, but it put me at eye level with that famous Warner Salmon painting of Jesus knocking at the door. And I had always loved Sunday school and church, but I wasn't aware of that story. So I asked my mother about it, and she said it was symbolic that that door represented the door of my heart and that Jesus was knocking, but he wouldn't open the door. I had to open the door to him. And so she led me to Revelation 3:20. Theologians tell me that's not a salvation verse, but it certainly was for me. And the sort of irony of that painting is I used to tell that story a lot. Of course, my testimony, I was always wishing I had a more dramatic testimony than being raised in a Christian home. And until I realized that people who have come out of really horrible backgrounds would do anything to change places with me and have that privilege. But when I met my wife about 15 years after that is when I got married. We shared our stories, of course, and our testimonies. And I told her that story. My grandfather was also an artist and was a friend of Warner Sallman. They lived and consulted each other before Sallman drew his famous Head of Christ. So we've told that story, and then somebody in the family, I think it was one of our niece's husbands, saw on a PBS special that somebody had bought two originals of Warner Sallman's Head of Christ
Right,
and paid peanuts for them and found out they were worth a lot of money.
right.
And bottom line is we just had to have those, and those are hanging in our house now. And it's a small world, but it brings that whole spiritual story together.
Well, that's incredible. As we think through in our lives, I mean, for me, I accepted the Lord many, many years ago. I accepted the Lord right before I got out of high school, and that was in the late 70s. But and I think about people that God's brought along my way that I either they've built into my life or I've worked with, and Christian leaders and so on. And it's been amazing, and I've been blessed by that. And that's all been a part of my journey and growing my walk with the Lord. But in a conversation that Emily Sherwood, who oversees our academics and our counseling here at the school, she was she was sharing an interesting scenario or situation that you had shared about at a meeting where she was. But Emily, what was that? Tell us a little bit about that, or that question you had about that with that well-known Christian celebrity.
Yeah, so at my commencement ceremony at Colorado Christian University, you had talked a lot about your work with Billy Graham and how close you were associated with him for quite some time. And you talked about a lot of the takeaways that you had with him, throughout your life and the experiences and the way he was able to help you grow so much. But I was just kind of curious, looking back, what do you think is one of your biggest takeaways from that time with Billy Graham?
Well, that's an important concept, the idea of takeaway value, because I teach writers online and I always tell them that a book can't simply be about something or someone. It needs to be for the purpose of something.
Yeah.
And after working with Mr. Graham for several months, traveling to North Carolina and meeting with him, privilege of a lifetime, I started wondering, do I have more than just a book about Mr. Graham or his autobiography? What is the takeaway value? What can readers get from this besides all the success, the big meetings, the people coming to faith, which is all inspiring? But what's the takeaway for the reader? And so I kind of clumsily went about asking him that. We were sitting in his office and knee to knee, and I was trying to, I went about it the wrong way. I said, people put you on a pedestal. They consider you sort of the Protestant Pope. They look to you for an example. And he was waving me off saying they shouldn't do that. He said, when I think of the number of times I've failed the Lord, I feel this low. And he put his hand right on the floor. And I thought, wow, this is Billy Graham, who's, seems like everything he touches turns to spiritual gold. And but I finally stumbled on the right question. I said, well, how do you maintain your own spiritual disciplines?
Mhm.
And he came alive at that question. And he just, bore into me with those steely blue eyes of his. And he said, the the Lord doesn't make that a secret. It's in the Bible that we're to pray without ceasing and search the scriptures. And he says, I do that. And I thought, wow, you pray without ceasing? Because I've tried to pray without ceasing, and I get about 2 minutes in and start thinking of the Chicago Cubs. And of course, that does lead me back to prayer. But um, so many people I talk to, they talk about, wow, praying without ceasing. Is that symbolic or is that real? And he said, I do. I pray without ceasing. He said, I have every waking moment since I received Christ as a teenager. And, at the time I was interviewing him, he was a senior citizen already. He said, in fact, I'm praying right now as I'm talking to you that everything I say and everything we put in this book glorifies Christ and not me. And I was moved. I was touched almost to the point where I was speechless. And I said, well, how does your um, searching the scripture, what form does that take? And he said, well, wherever I am in the world, whether I'm on the continent or at home or wherever I'm traveling or anywhere, the first thing I do in the morning is I open my Bible and set it somewhere where I'll notice it during the day. And every time I notice it, I'm going to stop and read a verse or two or a chapter or two or for an hour or two. And he says, it's not for sermon preparation or writing books or anything. It's just for my own spiritual nourishment. And I looked over his shoulder, and there on the desk of his office was that open Bible. And I remember thinking, I wanted takeaway value, and here it is. But has he set the bar so high that nobody can, identify with this? And I said, so what happens when you miss a day? And he looked puzzled. He kind of cocked his head and he said, I don't think I've ever done that. I said, you never miss. And he said, no, I told you this is for my own spiritual nourishment, and I don't want to go hungry
Right.
spiritually. I remember going back to the car that day and thinking, do I have takeaway value? I mean, what is it that makes Billy Graham who he is? The fact is, as he said, Scripture doesn't hide it from us. We're to pray without ceasing and search the Scriptures. The difference between him and the rest of us lay people is that
Mhm.
he does it. That's the takeaway value.
Yeah. That is pretty incredible. And it's
Mhm.
another one of those times where that so much is caught as well as being taught. And just seeing that particular example anyways, then with that. Thank you for sharing just that insight. As I think about you've written so many books. I laugh what your son said. You probably have gone ahead and you have written more maybe than you have read. But I'm sure you have read far more than 200 books. But I find it interesting. Quite a number of the books that you have written have dealt with the topic of eschatology or the end times. And so I guess I'm a little curious what has led to, or what led to the focus of so many of your books being on that particular topic.
Yeah, it happens that, as you mentioned, I was born and raised in Kalamazoo, Michigan, at least till I was 13. We moved to Illinois. But I was raised in a little church, Oakwood Bible Church in Kalamazoo. And it was kind of a fundamentalist church and believed in a premillennial, pre-tribulational rapture of the church. And I've never been a theologian or a scholar, but I was raised in that tradition and believed that way. And really, the idea for the Left Behind series came from Dr. Tim LaHaye. And it turns out, now he was the age of my parents, so there was a sort of father-son dynamic when we got together. But it turns out he also was raised in Michigan, and his mother also led him to Christ. And of course, he was raised in the tradition of the pre-tribulational rapture, and was a scholar and a theologian. And so he really was into that, and it was his idea. I got the fun part. I got to write every word, but he kept me on track theologically and from a
Right.
scholarship standpoint. But that's where that interest came from. And I realized there are other views of eschatology and people that are smarter than I am, and for sure people that are more devout and I have no doubt of their salvation. They believe in a different timing for the rapture. And that's not a hill I'm going to die on. Dr. LaHaye would have. He said he thinks everybody's going to get their minds changed in the air.
Right.
But my feeling is we know Jesus said he was coming back. When exactly that happens, the sequence of it, we need to be ready regardless.
Right.
I happen to believe pre-tribbers get to go first, but anybody who believes that Jesus is coming back and is counting on him for their salvation will be going with him.
Right.
Mhm.
That area of southwestern Michigan, I've always kind of during my Christian life have looked at that kind of as a northern Bible Belt. So many
Yeah.
great things and people and areas that come out of there. But then when I did my studies at my graduate studies at Dallas Theological, it was one of those scenarios with men like John Walvoord and so on. Even one of my favorite teachers today, still Dr. David Jeremiah.
Oh,
And
yeah.
so with a lot of their teaching, and so I can appreciate where that you are with that. But that's just interesting because typically on topics, there's kind of a connection and why someone either speaks a fair amount, teaches a fair amount, or writes on a particular topic or genre, anyways, of literature with that. We've joked about, or you joked about your son first. So I want to make sure we know that you made the joke about the books and the reading first with your son Dallas. But he's the creator of the TV series The Chosen, which has been very, very popular. I guess the question is, did he get any of his creative inspiration and some of his ideas at all from you, or how has that been? And even getting to work with him on that area, because I believe you're doing the writing for the books then associated, correct?
Right. I'd love to take all the credit for Dallas and his creativity. Um, I mean, he was raised in the home of a storyteller, and I can remember when he and his two younger brothers were kids, we used to riff about the idea of, what must it have been like for Jesus as a child? Wouldn't his siblings have said, well, he can do no wrong. He never gets punished. Or if he went on a date as a teenager, would the girl have said, I just met the perfect guy? We would kind of riff about things like that. And I have written a lot of biblical fiction. I did novels based on the four gospels. I did a novella based on Joseph and Jesus, his earthly father, and things like that. And Dallas saw those. But I helped Dallas get started in his Hollywood career way back in the day because I had the means from Left Behind to finance his pictures. but the chosen is all his. And so I feel like I'm sort of pressing my nose up against the glass, asking my own son if I can play too, you know.
Right.
And he was happy to have me write a novel for each season of The Chosen. And if we've got, I realize we're pressed for time, but I have a real quick anecdote of
Yep.
visiting him on the set a year ago on his 49th birthday. I was remembering the day of his birth, like I do for all my kids when their birthday comes up, and I had locked in all those memories, and it was great to watch him work. And we were in a big soundstage that had been transformed into the Garden of Gethsemane. They had imported the dirt and imported olive trees from California, and he was using torchlight instead of lighting because he likes that natural light. And he asked me if I would want to stand behind him while he directed this scene, and I jumped at the chance. I knew my place. I was to be quiet and just watch him work. So I'm standing right behind him as he's directing this, and it turns out on his birthday, while I'm so overcome with these memories, he's directing us a father-son scene. And they've imagined Joseph, his Jesus' earthly father, visiting him in the garden and telling him, encouraging him, and saying, "I'll be waiting for you." I was so overcome that I had to press my hand over my mouth to keep from whimpering on mic. And at the end, all I could do was embrace Dallas. And he said, "I forgot you were a blubberer. Thanks for keeping it together while we were shooting." But that's a memory I'll never forget.
Oh, yeah. And I'm sure just even the joy that it brings to your heart, even uh, seeing what your son's involved with now as a man, as a grown man, but knowing that, through your life and the things that you've tried to pass down and to work down through with that I can fully understand. I have two adult children, and I've got a daughter getting ready to go to the mission field here Saturday morning. So it's
Oh,
like
wow.
I can appreciate your feelings and your emotions that you shared with that. Well, one of the things that I think about here at Christian Academy, just we're in the business of education, but we're in Christian education. Uh, I think back, I know in your own life, when you were out of high school, you had come to the point where you had gone to Moody Bible Institute. Later, I believe you served on their board. You're on the board now at Colorado Christian. But as you think back about even those days at Moody Bible Institute, what kind of an impact did that Christian education, that foundation have for you in all that you're doing? And do you see that at any grade level, age level? We work preschool through 12, but tell me a little bit about your thoughts on just the importance of having a good, solid Christian education.
Yeah, I'm a huge supporter of Christian higher education. I happened to go to a public school, K through 12, and back then, that's a long time ago. I think rainbows were still black and white back then, but, but they didn't teach the kind of stuff they teach today and allow the kind of things they allow today.
Right.
My parents probably would not even allow me in a public school if I was growing up today. But I can remember, even though it was a fairly good experience and I had a lot of fun experiences in high school and stuff, going to Moody and being with at that time 900 or 1,000 students on campus. They were all just like me, raised in Christian homes, believing the Bible, believing the truth, and then studying the Word every day. It was fantastic, and it happened. We so believe in that. My wife went to Fort Wayne Bible College,
Uh-huh.
and all three of our sons are graduates of Christian colleges.
Right.
And so we're really we really believe in that. And having been privileged to serve on the boards at Moody and Colorado Christian, I love seeing these kids come in, and we realize a lot of the guys on the boards, on these kind of boards, are businessmen. And they often say, if this were a business, these students are our product. This is what we're putting out. We want to change the world, and this is how we do it by training them in the word so they can impact the culture.
Right. Thank you for that. I have to smile. You mentioned that your wife went to Fort Wayne Bible College. It's normally not called that today, but
Right.
I think back, it was a month before I got out of high school. I was not a Christian. I thought I was because I went to church. But a friend of mine who had just become a Christian invited me to a weekend youth conference at Fort Wayne Bible College.
Huh.
The speaker was a gentleman by the name of John DeBrine from the Cape Cod area. He was a chaplain for the Red Sox. but John gave the gospel invitation. And so for all these years now, and I share my testimony, I always share, yeah, a friend invited me to Fort Wayne, the Bible College, and that was, I will never forget that, but it's just so incredible. We
Yeah,
appreciate
it's
that so much. You know, another thing that Emily and I were chatting about was, again, something else that you had shared at this commencement address, anyways, here just a few years ago, dealing about qualification or feeling qualified. But Emily, what were your something that stood out to you about that?
Well, I mean, as graduates, we're sitting there getting ready to embark on the next part of our journey, and we're all kind of sitting there thinking, okay, are we really doing this? What's coming next? And there was something that you had said that you had faced, a question that you had faced even when working with Billy Graham in the very beginning stages, and that was what qualifies me to perform this task? What makes me able to do this? And that was something that I remember looking at the graduates next to me, and we're like, oh man, he hit that on the head. We really resonate with that statement of what qualifies us. And so I was just kind of wondering, what words of encouragement do you have for those who may find themselves asking that very question?
Yeah, what happened there was that when I was up for this job, there were 4 or 5 writers that were up for to help Mr. Graham with his memoirs, and I thought I had made a huge mistake because when I went for the sort of final interview, the person asked me what qualifies you to write his biography, and had I prepared, I would have thought, well, I've done lots of well-known athletes, other evangelists. There are all kinds of reasons why, from a worldly standpoint, I would qualify to do this. But I hadn't anticipated the question. And I thought, well, how stupid could I be to not assume they would ask that question? And so I just answered honestly off the top of my head. I said, well, nobody's qualified to write Billy Graham's autobiography. All you can do is justice to one of the greatest stories that could ever be told. And later, when they told me I had gotten the assignment, they said, you were the only one of the candidates who admitted that you weren't qualified to do this. The others were trying to convince us. And
Right,
so my challenge would be to young people, none of us is qualified. In fact, none of us are qualified to be believers and be redeemed, be saved by Jesus. This is another little anecdote from The Chosen. There was a time when Jonathan Rumi, who's playing Jesus, is in a house and he's speaking to people and he's teaching. And Dallas can tell that Jonathan, the actor, is struggling and hesitating. So they take a little break, and Jonathan says, I just feel so unqualified to be saying these words of the greatest person who ever lived. And Dallas was able to share with him, none of us are qualified. That's the whole point of the gospel. We're all sinners. We all fall short. We're not qualified. If we can embrace that and say, but for God,
right,
I wouldn't be here, then we can do whatever we're called to do and count on him to be our portion.
right. The total dependence upon the Lord and what He wants us to do. I think of, in Paul in his letter to the Second Corinthians, just he was overwhelmed by his weaknesses, but yet he realized that when he was weak, then he was strong
Right.
because his strength did not come from himself and his accomplishments, his preparation, but rather it came in what God was going to go ahead to go through him.
Right.
Well, I guess one last question, think about, not everybody aspires to be a writer. And even I think in these days, not everybody aspires to do that, but it's a very unique talent, it's a very unique ability. And in that, I know we have students who they love to write. They love to read. They love to go ahead to write about stories of, various different areas anyways. Thinking back over your life and how that you had gotten started in your writing career, what would be some words of encouragement that you would pass on to young or even older aspiring writers, anyways, along the way for what they may feel that God wants them to do?
Yeah, I always say that writers are readers, and good writers are good readers, and great writers are great readers. So if you're not a reader, you're not going to be a writer. And if you want to be a writer, you have to be a reader. And you should be writing something every day, whether it's a journal, or a log, or if it's homework, whatever it is, be writing something every day. Even in this age of AI, which would like to write everything for us,
Right.
things need to be written, and they need to be written by people who put their own spin on it, their own life experience in it. So that's an important thing. And kind of an ironic thing, people often ask me when I was called to write. And ironically, I was never called to write. I wanted to be a writer. I talked my way into a sports writing job before I was old enough to drive. My mother had to drive me to the games and back to the newspaper
Right.
office. But when I felt called to full-time Christian work. And so I assumed I would have to give up the writing and study to be a pastor or a missionary. And the counselor that night said to me, don't be too quick to give up the writing because God often equips us before he calls us. If he's equipped you with this gift, that may be the vehicle you use to fulfill your bigger call. So that's where it comes down to for me.
Yeah. It's interesting. You use the word equip. There are two key words that we have in our mission statement for Christian Academy schools here in Sydney, Ohio. But that is to equip and to inspire a new generation of Christ-centered leaders.
Mhm.
And to be in that spot to where that I think about this even as God's moving me down the road of realizing these incredible group of young people that I get to work with every day, and even our staff that are younger than me, that uh, they're the ones that are going to go on and will continue on that path and do the work, Lord willing, that God has for them, and that's an exciting piece.
Right.
Well, we want to thank you so much, Jerry, for your time being with us today. One thing I have to ask a favor of you. Uh, we here at Christian Academy Schools, we're the Eagles. Christian
Mm.
Academy Schools, the Eagles. And every morning after we do announcements that go out through the school, we then have a phrase that we close out with, and that is "Go Eagles." And so I like to get everybody to do that, and we kind of do it. It gets funny. I'll hear that in the mornings, and some of the elementary classrooms are outside of where my office is, and I can just hear them screaming that, as they do that. But on a count of three, Emily and I will help you with this, but would you be willing to go ahead just to give a hearty "Go Eagles" on the count of
You
three?
bet.
You willing to help? Okay.
Sure.
1, 2, 3. Go
Go Eagles.
Eagles! All right. Hey, thank you. And it's been great spending time today with Jerry Jenkins, author, and just an incredible man of God. We appreciate all of your efforts and the work you're still doing. May you have an incredible day. Thank you and God bless.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
All right.